Good evening. My name is Bri. As All Hallows Eve grows closer, an ethereal wind drifts through the Vale and across the worlds of LARP, carrying whispers of dark tales and secrets from their world to yours. These are LarpTales from Beyond. They had told him not to go into the woods. It was too dangerous, the innkeeper had said, reminding the traveller far too much of his scolding father. But it was a 2-day ride around the wood, and only half a day through it. So his mind was made up as he urged his mare through the shadow of the trees. Sunlight was almost completely absent on the forest floor, the canopy hanging high above, like a dark shroud. The traveller pulled his cloak closer as the autumn breeze drifted down his neck, an icy chill that shook him to his bone. A snap broke the silence, clean and sharp as a knife. An animal, his rational mind concluded. What else would you find in the woods? Then another snap. And another. Bandits, maybe? The traveller spurred his horse on, but did not dare risk a gallop, for fear that the creature would trip in the bush and wound them both. Then another snap in the dark. So close his horse was startled. The poor creature veered left, nearly throwing the traveller from his seat. A giggle echoed in the darkness, sweet and joyful. The traveller let out a breath of relief. Children. It had to be children. Probably a group of kids from the local village, gone off to escape their parents, and it's what children all want to do. He had just tapped his mare to move on, when the bag slipped over his head, and he knew nothing but darkness. He awoke to the sound of a crackling fire. He was sitting on a log, a makeshift bonfire burning before him, and across the golden flames sat a woman. She was small, much smaller than he'd seen a woman before. Her eyes were like glass, fixated upon him, and across her skin swirls of grey danced, moving as if smoke. No one had mentioned Fae being in these woods. The locals must have known, but not a single one had uttered a word about it. A hand suddenly gripped his arm, and he jumped, but only to turn and see another Fae. Male this time, with close-cropped silver hair and a smile far too big for his face. The male cocked his head to the side, his expression dark and hard to understand, when suddenly another tap, this time on his other shoulder. A third Fae was in the group, small and pale-faced as the moon, with long dark hair twisting as ropes. She smiled gleefully, the only one of the three happy to see him. "What do you want?" he stuttered. The moon-faced Fae let out a frightful giggle. "We want a story," the Fae exclaimed. She leaned in close so he could smell her. She smelt of the undergrowth, bark and mushrooms and rot, and beneath that, a metallic scent. Blood. Animal blood, he hoped, though he was acutely aware that there was no sign of his horse. "A story," he muttered, disbelief coating his tongue like lacquer. "Yes," the Fae squealed. "Go on, tell us one. Why?" he blurted out. The Fae's eyes widened in surprise, before she then crossed her arms, a childish pout, crossing her lips as if she were a small child being refused sweets by their parents. "Because it's story time, and we need a story," she told him. "If we like it, we'll give you a gift." Beware of Fae gifts, his mother had always told him, for they could be a blessing or a curse depending on the Fae's mood. And what if you don't like it? He didn't want to know the answer. He didn't even know why he'd asked. The words had just tumbled from his mouth before he'd even had a chance to think. A smile broke out on the face of the pale-haired Fae to his left, the male grinning far too wide. His white teeth glinted in the firelight like knives. "Why?" he smirked. "We will eat you." The traveller swallowed, if anything to wet his throat that had gone dry from fear. A gift indeed, as if his life was something that could be bartered for. He did not dare glance about himself, looking through a path for the trees that could bring him back to sanctuary. But the darkness lined every trunk, and he had no idea which way he'd come. In truth, it was obvious. There was only one path to freedom here. "So, traveller," the smoke-skinned Fae now spoke, what say you?" He stared at her for a moment, before drawing a shivering breath, and he began to speak. "A long time ago, a kingdom was stuck in a bitter war. The battles had raged for years and years, without either side gaining any ground. A young mage decided to leave his small village and seek his fortune by joining the kingdom's army. He was clever and brave, and soon made a name for himself, turning the tide of war with his magic. The king was pleased with the young war hero and decided that he would be a great candidate to wed his daughter, but she was a jealous type and set the young mage a very specific condition. She refused to marry a man who would marry someone else if she were to perish, and so her condition was that after her death, her husband would have to reside in the tomb with her, whether he was alive or not. His potential bride was younger than he was, so the mage took his chances and accepted her outrageous condition. They were wed, and for a time they were happy. But by a terrible stroke of misfortune, one day the princess was thrown from her horse and was killed when her neck snapped. The young mage was true to his word, and when her funeral came, he entered the tomb behind her, carrying some bread, wine, a couple of books, and a few candles, and then the tomb was sealed behind him, leaving him to spend the rest of his days beside the corpse of his wife. He was down to his last candle when in the gloom he heard a voice. "Do you wish your wife to live?" The mage looked up to see that he wasn't alone in the tomb. A tall man stood over him, pale and imposing. A vampire. Where he could have come from, the mage did not know, but the vampire spoke again. "Do you wish your wife to live and leave this tomb?" The mage agreed. The vampire smiled, turned, and swept down onto the princess's body. And soon she rose, pale and cold, but alive of a sort, and happy to be reunited with her husband. Together the three of them pushed the stone from the tomb door away and walked out, back into the world. Some weeks later, the princess proposed to her husband that they took a voyage as a break from court life. The mage happily agreed, and they set sail. But 2 nights into the voyage, the mage awoke to find 2 figures standing over him: his wife, the princess, and the vampire. The vampire had raised the princess from the dead with the sole intention of making her his bride instead of restoring her to her husband. And now, comfortable with her unliving existence, the princess had happily agreed to the vampire's proposal. They dismembered the mage and tossed all of his remains overboard, and they sailed away, eloping to the vampire's castle. They too were happy for a time, but soon strange things began happening in the castle. The princess's favourite cat disappeared. Servants reported to their unliving masters that paintings in the corridors were weeping blood, and they swore they had seen a figure standing on the beach, staring at the castle for hours before turning and walking straight back into the sea, disappearing beneath the waves. And then finally, while taking a goblet of blood before they settled for the morning, the pair felt the blood catch in their throat and they collapsed, falling into an unnatural sleep. And then they awoke. They were back in the tomb, a single candle flickering in the dark. In the doorway stood the mage, grey-skinned and crudely sewn together as if a rag doll, held together by will and fury, who silently stepped backwards and raised his staff. The princess leapt forward, but she was not fast enough to prevent what she knew was about to come. The great stone door slid shut and glowed as it sealed, never to open again. The princess wanted a husband who would stay by her side in her tomb forever, and now she had one. Well, the traveller swallowed hard, holding his head high as if to hide the shivering that quaked through his entire body. He looked at the Fae, silent around their crackling fire. "I have told you my story, so tell me now, do I live? Or do I die?"